this is one of the things that Chase and I have been talking about nonstop in trying to formulate how we were approaching this tri-campus collaborative. You know, we were thinking together about the professionalization of transness within the neoliberal confines of the university, the ways in which we've been sort of made respectable through, you know, the academic pomp and sort of splendor and whatnot, but it's at the expense of what we're really good at, which is being unprofessional trans people who are good at fucking shit up, right? And so I like that you just pointed to this, you know, really sort of sticky sort of situation that we find ourselves in often, which is that trap between trying to have a voice within academia and trying to do right by community, but then also being stuck playing by those very rules, which is, you know, our day jobs. A comment that you made about trans celebrity and trans kids, and you know, you mentioned Jazz Jennings. I am Jazz, so I was thinking about the TLC show and the spectacularization of the childhood of Jazz. It was this, you know, sort of like ideal trans child subject. And, you know, thinking about the book that you wrote and your conversations about malleability and plasticity, and I was hoping that you could talk a bit, you know, with the folks who are watching about the ways in which figures of children like Jazz Jennings are sort of the ideal terrains for anxieties, or the quest for, you know, the erasure of transness at the end of the process, the achievement of gender stability, but also the ways in which that gender keeps escaping, right? It's very unstable throughout the whole thing. So yeah, I was hoping you could talk a bit about the spectacle of the trans child for mass consumption. You know, what might we envision the audience reception to be? So what are the purposes of folks like Jazz Jennings and those shows?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, you know, I just mostly worry a lot about trans youth who, for whatever reason, you know, enter the public spotlight. And that's, you know, that's a Jazz Jennings, but that's also youth activists, you know, who have spent their entire childhoods, for example, traveling to the Capitol, you know, building in Texas every year to beg for their basic rights. I think it's a really disturbing situation for young people to be put in. And you used a really great word, spectacle, right? When something is turned into a spectacle, it's sort of grossly exaggerated. It's also packaged up for an audience. And so most trans cultural production, most of the images, the stories that we see and consume every day for a general audience, they're made explicitly for non-trans people, right? So they're packaged up for people who aren't the ones we're seeing on screen. And so that's already a power imbalance. When it comes to youth and children, that's what we just do normally in, you know, in Anglo-American culture broadly conceived, right? So one of the things that childhood studies scholars make a distinction between that might be helpful is between the figure of the child, right? You can think of this capital T, capital C, right? The child and actual children. And we have these sorts of ideas about childhood, right, that are actually really powerful, and they actually condition real children's lives. But part of the problem is that the child is an ideal. It's just a concept. It's a story. It's wishful thinking about what we wish was true about how age is organized in our society. And it's a narrative that came into existence at the end of the 19th century. It's very much a British, American, Canadian kind of story there. And that narrative has dominated everything. It's had devastating consequences for people who can't, you know, live up to the ideal. And what is that ideal? You know, you could probably think of it because it just sort of lives in the air of our culture. Innocent, unknowing, right? A child who is unfinished, doesn't have an identity yet, doesn't know things, that children come into the world, not necessarily completely as blank slates, but just uncontaminated by everything. And then it's adults' job to cultivate them like little plants and grow them in the right direction so they end up where we want them to go. And historically, where we wanted them to go is heterosexuality, able-bodiedness, right? Nice gender binary, right? And so, you know, we've actually forcibly put children on that track. Right? It's not benevolent. A lot of things that are styled as care have been incredibly coercive. And so trans youth in that context, right, just do one really beautiful thing, right? When a kid comes up to the parents or the adults in their life and says, hey, you know, that little letter that got stamped on my birth certificate, that thing you've used maybe even before I was born, right? From an ultrasound to condition every way you've ever treated me and told me who I was, you're wrong. Let me set the record straight, right? And so trans kids do this amazing thing, right? I just want to say, I think that that act, right, commands so much respect. It completely reverses all the power dynamics between children and adults in one little moment, right? And so, of course, there's so much anxiety around trans youth because they question the idea that children, children's value is who they will grow up to be, not who they are now, right? Because trans kids are one of many kinds of kids who make demands for what they need now. No, I don't want to wait until I'm 18 to be in the right body or to have the right clothes or the right name or be called who I am. I would like to do that now, right? Like very normal thing to say, but one that we are very accustomed as a culture to saying no to, right? And so I think one of the reasons that trans children are turned into a spectacle is because often spectacles of children are ways to violently discipline, children back into a place that reassures, the public or just reassures social norms, right? And so that's why there's so many moral panics around children's sexuality, right? Historically, I mean, it's like we're living through plenty of them right now, but they're all like 100 to 150 years old. You can just see the exact same ones over and over again, right? Today, it's like YouTube and TikTok is making kids X, Y, Z, right? Well, okay. Before it was TV, and before that it was movies, and before that it was the radio, and before that it was dime novels, it was reading, right? People used to say that if kids read books, they would become, absolutely corrupt chaos agents, right? And be totally immoral. So it's a very old problem invented by Western culture. And I think that that's the situation that these trans youth step into, right, when they're made a spectacle. Now, there are plenty of reasons to choose to be made a spectacle, right? Maybe you have your agenda you want to push, right? Has jazz had a huge impact on how, TLC viewers, who are probably a pretty wide swath, right, of North American society, how they understand and empathize with trans people? Probably. I mean, I don't know. But one of the things we could think about is, what is the narrative stake here, right? And the word I would use is, it's about domestication. It takes that initial power and agency of the trans child who has challenged all the adults in their life, and it tries to walk it back. It says, oof, okay, that was wild, right? We just questioned the entire way that we raise children, the entire system of assigning gender at birth that we have, and all of our ideas about what a child is, right? But don't worry, it's actually all fun, because basically all we have to do is recognize that the child is trans, say yes to that, right? And then then you get all these experts, you get psychologists, you get doctors, right? And all what we're doing is we're welcoming this trans child back into the very conservative structure of the family and of society that we started out with. So nothing has to change. All we have to do is say, you're allowed to be here, right? That's really mismatched with what trans people, especially trans youth, might need. And so it puts all the pressure back on them to conform or assimilate in order to satisfy their family or the larger society that they live in. And so I think that's the best way to think about it, is the highest demand for assimilation is placed on trans youth, generally speaking. And that's, again, they only even qualify to play in those Hunger Games if they look kind of like the innocent child, right? It's sort of like, well, can we make you ideal and innocent again? Can we repackage you and make you sort of that perfect kid, right? I mean, this is the kind of sentimentality, right, that is really widespread in North American culture. And it has just terrible consequences because, most kids can't live up to that. Also, no one should have to, right? It ties young people's value to whether or not they coincide with our idea of who we would like them to be. That's just terrible, right? It's just objectively terrible. So I think, for me, one of the questions that I had, that I would say my thinking has shifted a little here since I published the book. Part of what I talk about is some critiques by scholars of the kind of clinicians who developed the contemporary pediatric gender-affirming care model. That's the one that includes the suppression or pausing of puberty. which is, the thing we always hear the most about trans kids. They're pausing puberty, right? And, when I was researching that, 5 to 10 years ago, that really did seem like the big question is like, what does it mean to pause puberty? And of course, one of the things I wanted to say as a historian is, well, we've been doing it for almost 100 years. Do you want to maybe look at that? Like it's not a new, right? I mean, making it a standard practice of care for trans youth, that's new. That didn't really start till the 1990s. But the medication's not new. The idea of modifying puberty's timing, not new. But, so one of the things that people were worried about, right, is that, okay, so if you pause puberty, and one of the reasons a lot of people wish they could have done it, right, if they had transitioned young enough or wish they had access, is that if you transition by pausing puberty and then go on hormones, you're more likely, just to pass by, society standards, right, whether you want to or not. So, one reason puberty suppression is so wonderful, right, is that, you can bank on living in the world with a little less antagonism relative to someone who didn't pause puberty. Okay, great. There were some concerns, though, from scholars that clinicians, not trans people, but clinicians, doctors, the people in charge of these clinics were so excited about that because they were basically trying to imagine a future where no one looked trans, right? Where everyone passed so perfectly, you could never know who was trans, right? And again, whether, I think there's a huge difference between trans people being interested in being able to pass, right, and clinicians wanting to incorporate that into their practice, because by extension, right, we could have imagined how trans kids might have, their progressive inclusion might have been weaponized against trans adults, against people who didn't pass well, or people who don't want to pass, although I think the relationship between those two is very messy. But in any case, I would have to say that, and so I make some, I rehearse a little bit of that in my book. I would have to say, though, since I wrote that, I don't think it's as much of a concern. One reason is, of course, famously, lots of places are like, oh, no, we're just going to criminalize children access to puberty suppression. So it doesn't matter. You can't even do it, right? But more broadly, my sense is from the data and from talking to clinicians, and actually almost no one really takes puberty suppression medication. It's like a very, very tiny amount of people. One of the reasons is just that North Americans have puberties that start a lot earlier than they used to for complicated reasons. And so most people, by the time you end up, if you end up in a clinic that could offer that, usually you're too old. So I just kind of think it's ended up not being the same kind of question that it was. And also goes to show how quickly the kind of terms have changed around access to healthcare for trans youth, right? Like 5 to 10 years ago, it was like, oh, things are maybe expanding and I'm a little worried about the authority of doctors here. And now it's like, oops, it's going to be illegal. And these kids are being detransitioned against their will and they're fleeing states and their parents are being investigated by the state for child abuse. I mean, and in all of that, that problem of the authority of doctors still hasn't been solved, right? Like now doctors get a free pass because they're supposedly on the side of trans kids, except there are all these doctors who have absolutely been infested with brain worms and are now like, I hold right-wing conspiracy theories about trans youth, even though like I make money from treating them, right? And so like things have moved a lot, I guess is what I'm trying to say there. I know I'm opening a whole other can of worms.
What I find quite stark is this interesting dynamic between discourses of medicalization and discourses of legislation. So on one hand, you've got the sort of, quote unquote, erasure of transness through, trying to create the most passable child then adult possible. So one is, we will make you disappear as trans, whereas legislation's like, we need to know what the truth of your gender/sex is, so we need to make you hyper visible as trans. So on one hand, you've got erasure. On the other hand, you've got this pull. And it very much speaks to other sorts of battles that are going on today in terms of the provision of healthcare, and then, the legislative forces that sort of fight against that healthcare. So that's a sort of a really interesting sort of dynamic that you've pointed out. A really quick question, in the book that you wrote, which again, I keep going back to because it was so much fun to read, you wrote quite a bit about the ways in which histories of race and racialization have played into the medical technologies and the sorts of interventions enacted upon children's bodies, upon trans kids. Do you mind speaking just a little bit? That's a lot. But could you just give us some of the sort of like highlights, the Cliff's Notes, if you will, of these intersections between histories of race and racism and the production of the trans child?
Yeah, it's a really important story. That protectable ideal child that we were just talking about, that child's white, explicitly. In the moment of its invention in the late 19th century, it's part of white supremacy. So none of those people are being shy about it. They think the future, right, of the race depends on taking care of white children to the explicit exclusion of or punishment of other kinds of kids, especially Black kids, brown kids, Indigenous kids, and immigrant children. And so, all of that gets folded into, basically how we understand child development, and how child development then shapes a series of psychological, psychiatric, and medical practices in the 20th century to this day. A lot of the language around race has been dropped after World War II, after the events of the Holocaust, for example, but a lot of the techniques that were designed with ideas of race and race management or race hygiene in mind, or eugenics, are still common practice. And this is true of almost every field of medicine. Trans medicine is actually really not that unique here, but the story goes something like this, right? We are often told to make a really strong distinction between sex and gender. We're told that that's a feminist gesture, or a queer gesture, or a trans-inclusive gesture. Sex has to do something with the body, right? And gender has to do with who you are or your identity. But that distinction was actually invented by psychologists. It was a medical device. It was invented in the 1950s. So before feminists even used the term, they would pick up on it maybe in the 1970s. It was really doctors and psychiatrists who were using this word gender, which wasn't used in the English language otherwise before, except to talk about grammar. And so the idea, though, that we've really doubled down on, right, is that the reason that we can transition is because there's something called gender, right? And who we feel ourselves to be. Today, we're probably likely to think of that as having to do with our brains, can be different from the rest of the physical body. And therefore, we can employ methods to change our physical bodies, if we wish, to match our gender. Right? That's the premise of trans medicine. But that premise itself was a premise that has a lot to do about race, right? So the invention of this concept of gender is something that can change, although it is also about how the body can change, right? But the idea that both can change, that we can change sex, as they used to say, and I think they still should, because you really can. But the idea that, your gender presentation can change, your gender recognition can change, the way you live in the world can change, your driver's license, whatever, can change to match who you feel yourself to be, right? That's not actually just a story of gender, it's a story about race. And here's the quick version of it. Prior to World War II, the idea of changeability, that very idea that the human body could transform, both physically, right, and according to one's personally held beliefs or their mind or their soul or their psyche, that was explicitly a plank of race science, right? This is not quack science. It's not pseudoscience, legitimate mainstream European science, really from the 19th century, but well into the 20th century, believed that the ability to change who you are is something that white people, not even just white people, but you can guess what I'm about, Northern European, white, Anglo-Saxon, yada, 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 that those people had the highest evolutionary capacity for change, right? And so the quote unquote other races were not as capable of transformation, right? Not a very nice idea. And unfortunately, that idea was so widespread that it later influenced everything, including the idea of doctors, right, helping people, quote unquote, change their sex, right? And so basically all of that translates, and we can see it in real time in some of the first clinics that are set up to see trans people, even before World War II. I mean, places like the Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore in the United States, right? You already see clinicians highly valuing white clients, white patients, right? And rejecting, especially Black patients, thinking that they just didn't deserve access to healthcare, right? But if you pushed those doctors, they would try to fall back on some sort of scientific rationale. And that rationale was always like, well, African Americans are not capable of transforming their bodies. They're locked in time because they're, evolutionarily inferior. And whereas white people are both supposedly more capable of transition, which is obviously not true, but are more seen as more deserving, right? And so how that really manifests is from the very moment that trans healthcare is delivered in any, recognizable way, it just happens to correlate perfectly with racism, right? But it has to do with that sex gender distinction and the way that that distinction was racialized. The very idea, right, that we are not, that, that biology is not destiny is actually in part a white supremacist discourse. It's part of the history of eugenics. And I think that's a very uncomfortable truth to sit with, because it really complicates a lot of progressive political discourse today, where we go all in on changeability, right? You are however you present yourself, any pronouns that you want, pick and choose whatever medical procedures you want, right? All of that sounds good, right, in a vacuum, but it actually carries this direct baggage. And it goes a long way to helping explain why people of color continue to be the least able to access transition, right? We could ask why. I mean, there's always an easy answer. Well, people of color in general have terrible access to healthcare. Okay, great. Sure. But if we want to really dig in and understand why, this is why. The very idea that gender is plastic, something that we've been told is a progressive belief, has a terrible racial history. And so that's one of the things that I really encourage us to wrestle with, because I think it would change the kinds of conclusions we come to today about the best way to narrate trans people's struggles and the best way to envision a better world for trans people. Is a better world a world where everyone can be a medical consumer, right? And go to a doctor trained in this tradition, right? And just say, I want this, I want that. I reflect on my internal gender identity and bring it into the world? Or maybe if we want to be, intersectional, do we have to have a more complicated vision that thinks about who would even end up in those spaces in the first place? Because I will say, and last thing on this point, having studied the clinics of the 1960s and 70s, the access that Black and Brown and Indigenous people have to trans healthcare today, I mean, if this is the scale, may move that much, right? That's not an empirical claim, but the point is, the way people talk about how much better trans healthcare is today, it's really not if you take race into consideration as a variable. It's barely budged. And the root problems, more importantly, are exactly the same, right? Trans people of color are much more likely to not just not be able to go to the doctor, they're more likely instead to end up somewhere else, policed, suspended from school, in conversion therapy, on a psych hold, in juvenile detention in jail. That's where they're going to end up instead. That has been the consistent theme of what I've seen for the past 70 or 80 years. So on that count, I think we still have a long, long way to go. All right, that was not a quick answer to a quick question, but what can I say?
Chase, I'm sorry for taking up so much airtime, but you guys have been able to chat with each other way before I showed up. So I'm just gonna draw this parallel, which might be problematic, but I'm gonna take a risk. You talked about racial hygiene in terms of eugenics, which is very much linked to sexual and moral hygiene in terms of the national body and the clean whatever. But what I'm venturing, what I'm sort of thinking about is the ways in which we're seeing a transgender hygiene of sort, the sort of sanitization of the trans body through the very mechanisms that you've just pointed to, criminalization, and we've seen this, the overwhelming criminalization of trans women and trans bodies of color more generally, but also the elevation of certain kinds of trans bodies, be there trans youth, which would be the ideal trans body, or certain trans adults, into sort of, this sort of hygienic imagination of what the ideal trans body could be. And we can draw parallels to the Jorgensen story, but also contemporary forms of representation that we see in mainstream media.
I think the other consistent theme is that at every era, someone tries to advance the cleanest, most accommodating, usually, most able-bodied racist, kind of fantasy of who a trans person could be, right? It almost never has any reference to any real person, even when there's a real person, right? You mentioned Christine Jorgensen, who has this incredible media story in the 50s, but it's like, it's totally made up, right? I mean, she's helping them make it up, but it's like very obvious that her real life doesn't correspond to the way she's depicted, right? But always, 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 the people advancing those images are just serving, the interests of the day, right? And it never works. That's the other, I think, important lesson is you can make the biggest pitch for respectability politics you want, but it doesn't do anything, because at any time, if you've staked your deservingness to be in the world on the blessings of the powers that be, you've given them all the power, and they can withdraw their blessing at any time they want. That's what we've been witnessing lately. And so a lot of the legislative and policy attacks on trans people, though I understand why they're incredibly alarming and shocking to a lot of people, one of the reasons that we're just so completely vulnerable to them is that eugenic policymaking and racist policymaking never ended, right? And so I, could use the example, say, of the state of Texas investigating the families of trans youth as child abusers, presumptive child abusers. And a lot of people were like, well, this is an egregious violation of the concept of child abuse. It's like, well, I mean, sure, on paper, yeah. But like, as a matter of course, the state of Texas has been reserved, like most states, has been using child protective services as a way to wage war on politically unpopular minority communities since it was invented. That's one of the reasons it was invented. Child protective services has played a pivotal role in cultural genocide of indigenous kinship structures, in a political war waged on the Black family as an institution, and most lately in Texas as a means of breaking up migrant families. And so it's not really, nothing new was happening in terms of the exercise of state power. The target was new in folding trans children into that list, but that list was already very long, and that power was already very illegitimate in its exercise. And so part of, I think, the ruse of the sort of liberal inclusion narrative that we often get handed to us with LGBT politics, right, is the idea that, well, the state is benevolent and is increasingly saying yes to groups, right, and when that's not even actually history. And in any case, the more power is handed to the state to decide who is in and who is out, right, only increases its ability to harm people. And it also means there are no safeguards. There's no way to say no, because we've already agreed in advance that it's okay for child protective services to be a tool of settler colonialism and racial violence. And so it doesn't really make sense when we're like, but not trans kids, right? That's just an absurd situation. Not saying that's intentionally how people understand it, but we've been put in that situation. So I think there are a lot of ways we can reframe our understanding of the relationship of trans people to state power in particular, right? And sometimes, I think, well, since I am, from Canada myself, it often can feel like, oh, well, we wouldn't do that in Canada, but of course we do, right? So that same, for example, that, state investigative power over families and children 100% exists throughout Canada. 1000% has been used as a tool of settler colonialism, in particular against Indigenous kinship structures. So the ingredients are already in place. Just to give an example, right? There may not currently be active investigations of family with trans youth, doesn't mean there couldn't be tomorrow, but in any case, the harms that have, come with that system are exactly the same.
Now, you're always welcome to take up more time with Jules, just for the record. So grateful for this time and for these ongoing conversations. And, as people who do different forms of interviews in media, there's always that pressure on the last question around, where are we going in the future, or what gets you out of bed in the morning, or where can we go from here? And I'm going to offer you up that bouquet of possibility. In part because I so enjoy your ongoing thinking and its responsiveness to current socio-political contexts and climates. And I'm curious to know what is most exciting and engaging about your research agendas or your fashion choices, or I see your incredibly textured paint behind you in your house. Any way you want to roll with that question, help us to guide our way forward and out of the conversation and into our day.
Sure. Well, for the record, the thing that gets me out of the bed in the morning is 2 shots of espresso. But you know, let me put it this way. There's a concept I'm working a lot with in my work right now. I'm working on a book at the time that we're recording this that is going to be titled A Short History of Trans Misogyny. And it's a book that tries to understand the harms that trans women specifically face, and actually some of the ways that the umbrella term trans, which has no specific gendered connotation, actually colludes with trans misogyny. And so actually how even the most progressive, supposedly inclusive left-wing discourses around trans people are often actually premised on the hatred of trans women in particular, and that they share with everyone else in society. And so I'm really trying to think about how widespread the hatred of trans women is, where it came from, what forms it has taken, where those forms arose around the entire world, actually. Not that I can write a book that's the history of the whole world, but, you know, just trying to take that inventory. And so it's like, you know, wow, okay, ambitious much. But one of the key concepts that I really needed to make sense of that, because it's a tricky task. I don't want to reinforce the idea that trans women are inherently worth hating, right? But I also don't want to sugarcoat reality or history, right, by implying that trans women are all goddesses who have overcome trans misogyny just by existing. Neither of those statements would be true. And so a concept I find really helpful is contradiction, right? Trans women and trans womanhood is often lived out through contradictions, right? Experiencing disproportionate violence, but as a consequence, being disproportionately inventive about life, right? Being the last girls you want to mess with, if you know what I mean. And I think contradiction is a really underrated term for our moment, in part because we live in an age of intense polarization, right? And polarization, you know, if we were to imagine that visually, is about opposites, things that are antagonists, things that are, you know, at odds with one another. And we imagine things very adversarially, right? We're encouraged to think of opposites as having to, you know, play out their battle and eventually one will win, right? I don't think that's really the lesson of history. I don't think that's really the lesson of being a trans woman in the world. I think it's more often that those things we see as opposites are in fact entangled with one another in a contradiction. And often the experience of life is that two things that shouldn't possibly be both true are, and your job in life is not to like solve that as if it were a math problem, but instead to figure out how do you live in the wake of that contradiction. And so I kind of want to offer that as my portal for talking about this moment and what comes next, because it's really, I think, challenging for a lot of us. And I think about this all the time when I'm teaching. So for those of you listening, you know, especially if you're, you know, part of the kind of general demographic age of students in university, things might feel really dark and dire, and the future might look really bleak. And it's difficult to respond to that hopelessness with anything but hope, right? With but optimism, but it's opposite, right? And to hope that like, okay, well, we're gonna triumph over it, right? And the best is yet to come. But the worse things get, right? Then the higher you have to raise, right, the bed of your optimism, and there, you know, there hits a saturation point where you start to feel a little uneasy, right? I think we've all been through that. So think about it instead as contradictions. This might be both the worst time in modern history for trans people and the best, right? And actually our job is not to ensure one outcome over the other, because no one is that powerful. What are we going to do in the meantime with that contradiction, right? So I think about, you know, as annoying as all the public advocacy work I have to do is, hey, I also get to just sit at home this summer and write a book, right? And the fact that I get paid to do that is really remarkable. That's the best my life has ever been, right? I think about all of the incredible trans art and cultural production and writing and just like sheer genius stuff being produced everywhere, all over the world, often not using the word trans at all because they don't need to, you know, like that's incredible. And we can get access to so much more of that. Like there's a lot going on right now that isn't just reacting to what is bad, right? And so I don't think we're living through a zero-sum game. And I think, you know, ultimately for me, maybe, you know, it's ironic for a historian to say this, but But what makes me happy is that the future is unwritten. It's always going to be unwritten. Where we are today is not the inevitable outcome of our past. And by that same token, where we're going tomorrow is not already decided. It will take invention, creativity, and a lot of collective action to push things in directions that, reflect our wants and desires. But there's absolutely nothing happening right now that means that we have lost that opportunity, right? The opportunity is never lost. I've never found a moment in history where trans people have lost the opportunity to craft their own futures. They just haven't. On the contrary, they've made just the most amazing things out of the most horrifying circumstances in life. And so that will continue, right? That will continue, but just don't shrink your imagination about tomorrow, because of what is going on today. I think that's understandable. I think we're all pushed in that direction, but what's going to come tomorrow is going to be as amazing as we make it. And so in that sense, I will say I'm excited, despite everything. I'm very excited. I don't know what's coming. I don't have a crystal ball, but thank goodness. I would be so bored if I did. That would be the worst thing for me. It's like I am an obsessive nerd and I like to study the past, in part because the past, your understanding of it changes, but the actual things can't change, right? Like they already happened. And I think one of the reasons I really appreciate that is because I actually don't like uncertainty. And so the future is the only time where I'm glad I don't know, because then it would be really boring. So let's think about what we want to do. And let's think about who we want to do those things with, and then, start doing them. I think that actually is true. And I think it can be a rewarding experience to understand that as the work of contradiction, and not the work of purifying bad into good, and knowing therefore that, what we do because we can do whatever we want and we deserve to do whatever we want. And we don't have to shrink our sense of what is possible to fit anyone's external definitions.
Jules, thanks for hanging out with us. We are so deeply appreciative of your time.
Well, thank you for having me. Thank you all who are tuning in and listening. Wish I could be enrolled in this class because you have some pretty amazing instructors, and congratulations on putting all of this together.
Thank you for everything.